Most people believe peace comes from fixing everything, explaining everything, and holding everything together. But Buddhism teaches a quieter and far more powerful truth. That peace begins the moment you stop gripping life so tightly. The harder you cling to people, outcomes, and expectations, the heavier your heart becomes, and the more life resists you. Yet when you loosen your grip, when you stop chasing answers and allow silence to replace struggle, something extraordinary happens. Life begins to rearrange itself without force. Clarity appears without effort, and the noise that once ruled your mind slowly fades away. This is not about giving up on life. It is about finally allowing life to move through you. When you let go quietly, life does not whisper, it speaks loudly, and in that voice, you discover a freedom that effort alone could never give you. 1. Letting go is not losing, it is returning to balance. Many people fear letting go because they associate it with failure, rejection, or weakness. But this fear comes from misunderstanding what letting go truly means. Buddhism teaches that letting go is not the act of throwing something away carelessly. It is the act of recognizing when something no longer belongs in your hands or your heart. In life, we often carry expectations, roles, relationships, and desires far longer than they are meant to be carried, not because they nourish us, but because we are afraid of the emptiness we imagine will follow if we release them. This fear convinces the mind that holding on is safer than letting go, even when holding on is the very source of our suffering. When you cling tightly to outcomes, you place your peace in the future, telling yourself that you will be calm only if things turn out a certain way. When you cling to identities, you trap yourself inside labels such as who you used to be, what others expect from you, or how you believe you must appear to the world. When you cling to expectations, you silently argue with reality, resisting life as it unfolds and wishing it were different. All of this clinging creates inner tension because life is always changing, while attachment demands permanence. The result is a restless mind that constantly fears loss, disappointment, or failure, even in moments that should feel peaceful. Letting go quietly does not mean giving up on life or becoming passive. It means releasing the unnecessary struggle against what is already happening. It is the decision to stop fighting reality and to meet the present moment as it is, without demanding that it conform to your fears or desires. In Buddhism, this acceptance is not resignation, but wisdom. It is the understanding that balance is lost, not because life is unfair, but because the mind refuses to flow with change. When you allow things to be as they are, you naturally return to balance, because balance is the mind's natural state when it is not pulled in opposing directions by craving and resistance. As you let go, something subtle but powerful happens within you. The constant mental noise begins to quiet, because there is no longer a battle to win or an image to protect. Energy that was once wasted on worry, control, and emotional resistance returns to you gently. You begin to feel lighter, not because your life suddenly becomes perfect, but because you are no longer carrying what was never yours to control. Peace arises not through effort, but through the absence of struggle, and in that peace, clarity begins to grow. Buddhism reminds us that balance is not something we must chase. It is something we uncover when we stop pulling ourselves away from the present moment. Letting go is the act of coming back to center, back to simplicity, and back to a way of living that is aligned with the natural rhythm of life. When you release what weighs you down, you do not lose yourself. You return to yourself, calmer, steadier, and more at ease with the unfolding of each moment. 2. Silence protects the mind more than explanation ever could. Many people feel an intense need to explain themselves, to correct misunderstandings, and to defend their intentions, believing that peace will come once others finally understand their side of the story. Buddhism teaches that this constant urge to explain is not born from wisdom, but from attachment to approval and fear of being judged. When you repeatedly justify yourself, you tie your inner peace to the opinions of others, giving them silent control over your emotional state. The mind becomes restless, replaying conversations, imagining arguments, and waiting for validation that may never come. When you choose silence instead of explanation, you are not admitting guilt or weakness, you are protecting your inner balance. Silence creates a boundary around your mind, preventing unnecessary emotional disturbances from entering. Many conflicts do not dissolve through words, because they were never created by misunderstanding, but by perception, ego, or fixed beliefs. No amount of explanation can change a mind that has already decided what it wants to believe. Buddhism teaches that wisdom lies in recognizing where effort is wasted and where energy is better preserved. Letting go quietly means accepting that not everyone needs to understand you, and not every version of you that exists in someone else's mind needs correction. When you stop explaining, you stop feeding the cycle of resistance and argument. Over time, life itself reveals truth more clearly than words ever could. Actions, consistency, and time speak louder than explanations, and they do so without draining your emotional energy. Those who are meant to see you clearly will do so naturally, without persuasion. Silence also creates space for self-observation. When you are no longer busy defending yourself, you can turn inward and listen to your own thoughts, emotions, and intentions with greater clarity. The mind becomes calmer because it is no longer scattered across multiple narratives and expectations. Buddhism values this inward stillness because it allows insight to arise naturally. In silence, you begin to see that peace does not come from being understood by everyone, but from understanding yourself deeply and acting in alignment with that understanding. By choosing silence, you reclaim your power quietly. You no longer react impulsively or speak from emotional agitation. Instead, you respond with awareness, or you choose not to respond at all. This restraint is not suppression, but mastery. It is the strength to remain grounded while life unfolds around you. When explanations fall away, the mind settles, and in that settled state, peace becomes stable and lasting. 3. Attachment is the hidden source of inner pain. Buddhism teaches that suffering does not begin with loss, failure, or hardship, but with attachment, because attachment binds your inner peace to things that are constantly changing. Many people believe that pain comes from what happens to them, but the Buddha revealed a deeper truth. Pain becomes suffering only when the mind refuses to let go. We suffer not because life takes something away, but because we demand that it should never have been taken in the first place. This demand silently creates resistance, and resistance is what turns simple pain into lasting inner turmoil. Attachment shows itself in many subtle ways. You may attach to people, believing they must always stay, always behave a certain way, or always meet your emotional needs. You may attach to outcomes, telling yourself that happiness will come only when life unfolds according to your plans. You may attach to identities, clinging to who you once were, how others see you, or how you believe you should be valued. Each form of attachment places conditions on peace, and the moment those conditions are threatened, fear, anxiety, and frustration arise. The mind becomes tense because it is constantly guarding what it is afraid to lose. Buddhism explains that everything in life is impermanent, including relationships, emotions, success, and even suffering itself. When you attach to impermanent things as if they are permanent, the mind is forced into a constant state of vigilance. You begin to worry about what might change, who might leave, or what could go wrong. This fear does not protect you, it exhausts you. The tighter you cling, the more fragile your inner world becomes, because it depends on forces beyond your control. Letting go of attachment does not mean you stop caring or loving. It means you stop demanding guarantees from life. When you let go quietly, you allow people to be who they are without trying to possess them. You allow outcomes to unfold without chaining your self-worth to success or failure. You allow emotions to rise and fall without believing they define you. This gentle release creates space in the mind, and in that space, suffering begins to dissolve on its own. As attachment loosens, something profound happens within you. You start experiencing life more fully in the present moment, instead of constantly worrying about the future or replaying the past. Joy becomes lighter because it is no longer burdened by fear of loss. Sadness becomes softer because it is no longer resisted. Even difficult experiences pass through you with less damage because you are not gripping them tightly. Buddhism teaches that when you stop holding life too tightly, life stops hurting you so deeply. True peace arises when you understand that nothing needs to be owned, controlled, or guaranteed for you to be whole. When you let go of attachment, you are not losing security. You are discovering a deeper stability that does not depend on external conditions. This stability comes from accepting change as a natural part of existence rather than an enemy to fight. In this acceptance, the heart becomes freer, the mind becomes clearer, and suffering gradually loses its power over you. Buddhism reminds us that attachment promises comfort, but delivers anxiety, while letting go seems frightening, but delivers peace. When you release attachment quietly, without anger or regret, you free yourself from the constant fear of loss. You begin to live with openness instead of defensiveness, trust instead of control, and calm instead of tension. In this way, letting go is not the end of love or meaning, but the beginning of a life experienced with depth, balance, and inner freedom. 4. When you stop chasing, life moves toward you naturally. Much of human exhaustion comes not from hard work, but from constant chasing, because chasing keeps the mind in a state of lack, always believing that something essential is missing and must be pursued. Buddhism teaches that the more desperately you chase happiness, approval, success, or certainty, the more distant they feel, not because life is cruel, but because chasing itself creates tension and blindness. When the mind is busy running after outcomes, it is never fully present, and anything gained under tension rarely brings lasting peace. The act of chasing convinces you that fulfillment exists somewhere else, in another moment, another version of life, another achievement, and this belief quietly steals contentment from the present. When you chase validation, your worth becomes dependent on how others respond to you, making your emotional state fragile and unstable. When you chase success obsessively, your mind never rests because there is always another goal, another comparison, another fear of falling behind. When you chase certainty, you resist the natural uncertainty of life, creating anxiety about things that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. Buddhism teaches that this constant striving does not lead to freedom, but to restlessness, because it places peace at the end of a race that never truly finishes. Letting go quietly means stepping out of this endless pursuit and recognizing that life unfolds more harmoniously when it is not forced. This does not mean abandoning effort or responsibility. It means releasing desperation and trusting the natural rhythm of cause and effect. When you stop chasing, you stop acting from fear and begin acting from clarity. Your actions become more grounded, more intentional, and less driven by the need to prove something. In this state, life responds differently, not because you demanded more, but because you created space for things to arrive naturally. Buddhism teaches that everything that truly belongs to you will come without resistance. Relationships that are meant to last do not require constant chasing or begging for attention. Opportunities aligned with your growth do not demand that you sacrifice your peace. When you stop forcing connections, situations, or outcomes, what is not aligned gradually falls away, often without conflict or drama. This quiet falling away is not loss. It is life-clearing paths that were never meant for you, making room for experiences that support balance rather than drain it. When chasing ends, awareness deepens. You begin to notice subtle guidance that was always present but drowned out by urgency. You become more sensitive to intuition, timing, and inner signals that guide your decisions gently rather than aggressively. Buddhism values this state of non-striving because it allows wisdom to surface naturally. Instead of pushing against life, you move with it, adjusting calmly when circumstances change rather than resisting or panicking. There is also a deep emotional relief that comes from no longer chasing. The body relaxes because it is no longer preparing for constant pursuit or disappointment. The mind settles because it no longer measures each moment against imagined futures. You begin to experience joy without fear of losing it, and effort without anxiety about results. Life feels fuller, not because you acquired more, but because you stopped running past what was already here. Buddhism teaches that peace is not something to be hunted down. It emerges when striving softens. When you stop chasing, you return to a natural state of openness, where actions arise from presence rather than pressure. In this openness, life meets you halfway. Opportunities align more smoothly, relationships feel more genuine, and growth happens with less resistance. Letting go of the chase allows life to approach you in its own time, and when it does, it brings lessons, experiences, and connections that feel lighter, truer, and more deeply fulfilling. When you understand this truth, you realize that stopping the chase is not giving up on life, but finally allowing life to breathe. You discover that what you were searching for outside was never meant to be forced, but invited through patience, trust, and quiet readiness. In this way, when you stop chasing, life does not become empty. It becomes receptive, and in that receptivity, life naturally moves toward you. 5. Detachment is clarity, not coldness. Many people misunderstand detachment because they associate it with emotional distance, indifference, or a lack of care. But Buddhism teaches detachment as one of the deepest forms of understanding rather than a withdrawal from life. Detachment does not mean closing your heart or becoming disconnected from people and experiences. It means learning how to relate to life without being controlled by fear, desire, or expectation. When you are attached, emotions pull you in many directions, causing you to react impulsively and suffer deeply. When you are detached in the Buddhist sense, you remain fully present, but you are no longer owned by what you feel or what you want. Attachment clouds perception because it filters reality through craving and aversion. You see people not as they are, but as you need them to be. You see situations not as they unfold, but as obstacles or rewards. This distortion creates disappointment because reality rarely matches the stories attachment creates. Detachment, on the other hand, clears this fog. It allows you to observe without clinging, to love without possession, and to care without the constant fear of loss. Buddhism teaches that clarity arises when the mind is free from grasping, because only a calm mind can see truth without distortion. Letting go quietly does not make you emotionally numb, it makes you emotionally wise. You still feel joy, sadness, love, and concern, but these emotions pass through you rather than trapping you. When someone disappoints you, detachment allows you to understand their limitations without taking their actions as a personal wound. When circumstances change unexpectedly, Detachment helps you adapt without collapsing into resistance or despair. This does not remove feeling from life. It removes unnecessary suffering from feeling. Buddhism emphasizes mindful observation as the foundation of detachment. By observing thoughts and emotions without immediately identifying with them, you create space between experience and reaction. This space is where freedom lives. Instead of reacting from anger, fear, or attachment, you respond with awareness. Over time, this practice transforms relationships because you stop demanding that others meet your emotional needs in specific ways. You become capable of giving love freely, without fear of loss, because your inner stability no longer depends on external behavior. Detachment also brings honesty. When you are not attached, you can see clearly when a situation, relationship, or pursuit is draining rather than nourishing you. You no longer stay out of fear of being alone or out of hope that things will magically change. Detachment allows you to walk away calmly, without resentment or guilt, because you understand that letting go is sometimes the most compassionate response for everyone involved. This clarity is not harsh. It is gentle, grounded, and rooted in self-respect. As detachment deepens, inner calm becomes more stable. The mind is no longer constantly swinging between desire and disappointment. You begin to trust yourself more, because your peace is no longer dependent on external circumstances aligning perfectly. Buddhism teaches that this inner stability is the foundation of wisdom, because a calm mind can respond skillfully to life's challenges. When clarity replaces emotional reactivity, your actions become more aligned with values rather than impulses. Detachment also reshapes how you experience love. Instead of clinging, controlling, or fearing abandonment, you allow love to exist freely. You appreciate moments without demanding permanence. You support others without trying to own their choices or outcomes. This form of love is lighter, deeper, and more authentic, because it is not rooted in fear. Buddhism teaches that true compassion arises when attachment dissolves, because compassion does not seek possession, it seeks understanding. When you let go quietly and practice detachment, life feels less chaotic and more navigable. You no longer feel pulled apart by emotional extremes or trapped by expectations. You move through life with steadiness, meeting both joy and difficulty with the same grounded presence. Detachment does not make you distant from life. It allows you to meet life directly, without distortion. In this way, detachment is not coldness, but clarity, and clarity is one of the greatest forms of freedom Buddhism offers. 6. Life speaks loudest when the mind is quiet. Buddhism teaches that much of human confusion does not come from life itself, but from the noise we create within our own minds. The mind is constantly talking, judging, comparing, replaying the past, and predicting the future, and in this endless inner dialogue, clarity is drowned out. When the mind is noisy, even simple situations feel complicated, decisions feel heavy, and life appears uncertain and overwhelming. We mistake this mental noise for thinking or problem-solving, but in reality, it is often fear, habit, and restlessness disguised as thought. Buddhism reminds us that wisdom does not arise from mental clutter, it arises from stillness. When the mind is busy, it demands answers immediately. It wants certainty, control, and reassurance, even in situations where none can exist. This urgency creates anxiety because life rarely moves at the speed the anxious mind demands. In this state, we stop listening to life and start arguing with it internally. We miss subtle signals, ignore intuition, and overlook opportunities because we are too focused on forcing outcomes or avoiding imagined threats. The mind becomes like a crowded room where many voices speak at once, making it impossible to hear what truly matters. Letting go quietly is the process of calming this internal chaos. It does not mean suppressing thoughts or forcing silence, but allowing thoughts to arise and pass without chasing them. Buddhism teaches mindfulness as a way to observe the mind without becoming entangled in it. When you stop feeding every thought with attention and emotion, the mind naturally begins to settle. This settling is not emptiness or dullness, it is clarity returning. In this quieter state, awareness expands, and you begin to notice what was always present beneath the noise. As the mind quiets, life begins to feel less hostile and more intelligible. Situations that once felt confusing start to make sense, not because they changed, but because your perception did. You become more sensitive to timing, tone, and subtle shifts in circumstances. You start recognizing when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to remain silent. Buddhism teaches that this discernment arises naturally from stillness, because a calm mind can see clearly without distortion from fear or desire. In a quiet mind, intuition becomes audible. Intuition is not mystical or supernatural. It is the body and mind communicating information that logic alone cannot access. When mental noise is reduced, intuition guides you gently, often as a sense of ease or resistance rather than a loud command. You begin to feel when something aligns with you and when it does not. This guidance does not shout, it whispers, and it can only be heard when the mind is no longer shouting over it. Letting go also quiets emotional reactivity. When the mind is noisy, emotions escalate quickly, turning minor challenges into major disturbances. A quiet mind creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, you gain the freedom to choose how to respond rather than reacting automatically. Buddhism places great importance on this space because it is where wisdom replaces impulse. Instead of being controlled by anger, fear, or attachment, you respond with awareness and balance. As inner quiet deepens, your relationship with time changes. You stop rushing through moments or living mentally in the future. The present moment becomes richer because your attention is no longer divided. You notice simple details, subtle beauty, and small signals that were previously ignored. Life feels fuller, not because more is happening, but because you are fully present for what is happening. Buddhism teaches that presence is the doorway to peace, because peace cannot exist anywhere else but now. A quiet mind also transforms how you experience difficulty. Challenges still arise, but they no longer overwhelm you in the same way. Without excessive mental commentary, problems appear more manageable and less personal. You see them as events rather than threats to your identity or worth. This shift reduces suffering dramatically, because much of suffering comes from the stories we tell ourselves about what is happening rather than the event itself. Buddhism teaches that when the mind stops narrating endlessly, suffering loses its grip. When the mind is quiet, life communicates through experience rather than explanation. You learn through observation instead of force. You begin to trust the unfolding of events without needing constant reassurance. This trust does not come from blind faith, but from repeated experience of clarity arising when you stop interfering mentally. Over time, you realize that many answers arrive not when you search for them aggressively, but when you create the inner conditions for them to emerge naturally. In this quiet state, your actions become more precise and less wasteful. You speak when words are necessary and remain silent when silence is wiser. You act when the moment calls for action and wait when waiting is more skillful. Buddhism teaches that this alignment between inner state and outer action is the essence of right living. When the mind is quiet, life does not feel like a constant battle. It feels like a dialogue where listening is just as important as doing. Letting go quietly does not make life passive or empty. It makes it responsive. You are no longer trying to overpower life with thought or control, but cooperating with it through awareness. The quieter the mind becomes, the more clearly life's direction reveals itself. You begin to understand that life has always been guiding you, but its guidance is subtle and easily missed by a restless mind. Buddhism teaches that silence is not the absence of sound, but the absence of resistance. When resistance dissolves, clarity flows naturally. In this clarity, you discover that life speaks not through noise or force, but through timing, feeling, and understanding. When the mind is quiet, you do not need life to shout, because you are finally listening. 7. Freedom begins the moment you release control. Buddhism teaches that the deepest form of suffering does not come from pain, loss, or uncertainty, but from the belief that life must be controlled in order to feel safe. From an early age, the mind learns to seek control as a form of protection. We try to control outcomes so we do not feel disappointed, control people so we do not feel abandoned, and control the future so we do not feel afraid. Over time, this habit becomes so ingrained that we mistake control for responsibility and fear for caution. Yet Buddhism reveals a profound truth. The more you try to control life, the more confined you become, and the less you try to control, the freer you feel. Control creates the illusion of safety, but it quietly generates anxiety. When you believe you must manage every detail of your life, your mind never rests. It constantly scans for threats, mistakes, and uncertainties, preparing for problems that may never arrive. This state of constant vigilance drains your energy and keeps your nervous system in a subtle state of tension. Buddhism teaches that this tension is not caused by life itself, but by the mind's refusal to trust the natural flow of existence. When you attempt to control what is inherently unpredictable, you place yourself in conflict with reality, and that conflict becomes suffering. Letting go of control does not mean becoming careless, passive, or irresponsible. It means understanding the difference between what you can influence and what you cannot. Buddhism emphasizes wisdom over force. You take right action where action is possible, and you release attachment where control is impossible. This balance allows you to move through life with steadiness rather than struggle. When you release the need to control outcomes, you stop measuring your worth by success or failure, and your sense of self becomes more stable and grounded. Many people fear that if they stop controlling, everything will fall apart. But Buddhism teaches that life is already unfolding according to causes and conditions far beyond individual will. You are not holding life together, you are participating in it. When you loosen your grip, life does not collapse, it reorganizes. Situations that felt rigid begin to soften. Paths that felt blocked begin to shift. This does not happen because you forced change, but because you stopped resisting what needed to change. Freedom begins when you realize that control was never the source of stability, but the source of tension. Releasing control also transforms how you relate to fear. Fear thrives on imagined futures and worst-case scenarios, convincing you that vigilance is necessary for survival. Buddhism teaches that fear loses power when you return to the present moment, because the present rarely contains the catastrophes the mind predicts. By letting go of control, you stop feeding fear with constant mental rehearsals. You learn to meet uncertainty with openness rather than resistance. Over time, this openness becomes courage, not the loud, forceful kind, but a quiet courage rooted in trust. As control dissolves, patience naturally deepens. When you are no longer forcing timelines, you allow things to unfold at their own pace. This patience is not passive waiting, it is active presence. You remain attentive, responsive, and engaged, but without the urgency that creates stress. Buddhism teaches that impatience is often a sign of attachment to outcome, while patience is a sign of alignment with reality. When patience grows, frustration diminishes because you are no longer demanding immediate resolution from life. Releasing control also changes the way you experience relationships. When you try to control people, you carry constant disappointment because people are not objects to manage. They have their own fears, desires, and paths. Buddhism teaches compassion through acceptance. When you release control, you allow others to be who they are without trying to shape them into what you need. This does not mean tolerating harm, but it does mean letting go of the fantasy that control will create security. Relationships become lighter and more authentic when they are based on mutual presence rather than hidden demands. Inner freedom grows as you stop trying to control your emotions as well. Many people attempt to suppress sadness, anger, or fear, believing they should only feel positive states. Buddhism teaches that emotional control creates inner conflict, while mindful acceptance creates healing. When you allow emotions to arise without resisting or clinging, they move through you naturally. You discover that emotions are temporary experiences, not permanent truths. By releasing control over your inner world, you gain a deeper sense of peace because you are no longer fighting yourself. As you practice letting go of control, trust slowly replaces tension. This trust is not blind optimism, but a grounded understanding that you can meet whatever arises with awareness. You stop needing guarantees in order to feel okay. You begin to rely on your ability to respond rather than your ability to predict. Buddhism teaches that this shift is the foundation of true freedom because life will always be uncertain, but your relationship with uncertainty can be peaceful. With less control, presence deepens. You stop living ahead of yourself and return fully to what is happening now. Simple moments become richer because your attention is no longer divided by worry. You notice your breath, your body, your surroundings, and the subtle rhythms of life. This presence anchors you, making you less reactive and more resilient. Buddhism emphasizes presence because it is the only place where freedom can be experienced directly. Over time, letting go of control reshapes your identity. You no longer define yourself by achievements, failures, or external validation. You begin to experience yourself as awareness rather than as a role or story. This shift brings profound peace because awareness is not threatened by change. When circumstances shift, you remain steady because your sense of self is no longer tied to what happens outside of you. Freedom, in the Buddhist sense, is not the absence of responsibility or challenge, it is the absence of inner resistance. When you release control quietly, without bitterness or fear, you align yourself with life rather than against it. You stop exhausting yourself by trying to manage what cannot be managed, and start conserving energy for what truly matters. In this alignment, life feels less like a struggle and more like a continuous unfolding. Buddhism teaches that liberation does not arrive through force or domination, but through understanding. The moment you see that control was never necessary for peace, a weight lifts from the mind. You realize that you are allowed to be here without having everything figured out. You are allowed to rest in uncertainty without fear. You are allowed to live fully without gripping life tightly. Freedom begins the moment you release control, because in that moment you stop fighting reality and start living in harmony with it. You discover that peace does not come from managing life perfectly, but from trusting your ability to meet life as it is. When control falls away, what remains is clarity, resilience, and a quiet confidence rooted in acceptance. This is not the end of effort, but the end of unnecessary struggle, and in that ending, true freedom quietly begins. 8. Letting go quietly allows life to rebuild you from within. Buddhism teaches that real transformation does not happen through force, urgency, or dramatic change, but through quiet inner shifts that slowly reshape the way you see and experience life. Many people try to fix themselves by pushing harder, becoming stricter, or demanding immediate results, yet they remain stuck because true change cannot grow in a tense and resisting mind. Letting go quietly creates the inner conditions necessary for genuine rebuilding, because only a relaxed and open mind can heal, learn, and evolve naturally. When you hold on tightly to old wounds, past mistakes, regrets, or identities, you unknowingly keep yourself anchored to an outdated version of life. The mind repeats old stories, reminding you of who you were, what went wrong, or what you lost. And these stories become the lens through which you see the present. Buddhism teaches that clinging to the past is a subtle form of resistance because it refuses to allow the present moment to be new. Letting go quietly does not mean denying what happened. It means releasing the emotional grip that keeps the past alive inside you. As you let go, the mind slowly stops reliving old pain. This does not happen all at once, but gently, as awareness replaces habit. You begin to notice when thoughts pull you backward, and instead of following them, you allow them to pass. This creates mental space, and within that space, something new begins to grow. Buddhism teaches that emptiness is not absence, but potential. When the old patterns loosen, the mind becomes fertile ground for clarity, compassion, and insight. Letting go also allows life to correct you without breaking you. When you resist change, life often feels harsh, because lessons come through struggle and conflict. When you release resistance, life teaches you more softly. You begin to learn through observation instead of pain, through reflection instead of collapse. Buddhism emphasizes learning through awareness, because awareness allows growth without unnecessary suffering. When you stop clinging, life no longer needs to shout its lessons, it can whisper them. Quiet letting go also rebuilds your relationship with yourself. Many people live in constant self-judgment, measuring themselves against impossible standards or past versions of who they think they should be. This inner pressure creates exhaustion and dissatisfaction. Buddhism teaches self-compassion as an essential part of awakening. When you let go quietly, you stop attacking yourself for not being perfect or complete. You begin to treat yourself as a process rather than a problem. This shift allows patience, forgiveness, and acceptance to grow naturally within you. As inner pressure dissolves, emotional balance slowly returns. You are no longer constantly reacting to life with defensiveness or urgency. Instead, you respond with greater steadiness because your sense of self is no longer under constant threat. Buddhism teaches that a stable inner foundation is built through non-attachment and awareness. When you let go quietly, your emotional world reorganizes itself around calm rather than fear, and this calm becomes the ground from which wiser choices arise. Letting go also allows you to rebuild your relationship with uncertainty. Many people fear uncertainty because it represents a loss of control, but Buddhism teaches that uncertainty is the natural state of life. When you accept this, you stop bracing yourself against the unknown and begin to meet it with curiosity rather than fear. This openness transforms uncertainty from a threat into a space of possibility. You become more adaptable, resilient, and creative because you are no longer rigidly attached to one outcome or direction. As you continue letting go, your priorities begin to shift naturally. Things that once felt urgent lose their grip, while what truly matters becomes clearer. You spend less energy on proving yourself and more on living meaningfully. Buddhism teaches that clarity arises when desire and fear quiet down. When this happens, you begin to act from values rather than impulses. Your actions feel more aligned because they are no longer driven by inner conflict or external pressure. Quiet letting go also changes how you experience growth. Instead of measuring progress by dramatic breakthroughs, you begin to notice subtle improvements in patience, awareness, and inner stability. You become less reactive, more present, and more compassionate, not because you forced these qualities, but because the conditions for them to arise were created through release. Buddhism teaches that growth is organic, not mechanical. When you stop forcing yourself to become something, you allow yourself to unfold into who you already are. Life responds differently to someone who has let go quietly. You carry less tension, which makes interactions smoother and decisions clearer. People sense your calm and respond with less resistance. Opportunities arise more naturally because you are no longer pushing against life's rhythm. This is not a reward for letting go, but a natural consequence of alignment. When you stop resisting, life stops resisting you. Over time, letting go quietly rebuilds trust, not just in life, but in yourself. You realize that you do not need to control everything to be okay. You learn through experience that you can meet challenges with awareness and survive uncertainty with grace. This trust becomes a deep inner confidence, not based on guarantees, but on resilience. Buddhism teaches that this confidence is far more stable than any form of external security. As rebuilding continues, you begin to experience a quieter form of happiness. It is not dependent on excitement or success, but rooted in ease and contentment. You feel more at home in your own mind, because it is no longer a battlefield of competing demands. This sense of homecoming is one of the greatest gifts of letting go. Buddhism teaches that peace is not found by becoming someone else, but by removing what obscures your natural state. Letting go quietly does not erase challenges or pain, but it changes how deeply they wound you. When difficulties arise, you meet them without the added burden of resistance and self-judgment. You recover more quickly, learn more gently, and move forward with less fear. This resilience is not toughness, it is flexibility. Buddhism teaches that flexibility is a form of strength because it allows you to bend without breaking. In the end, letting go quietly allows life to rebuild you from within, layer by layer, without violence or force. You become calmer, not because life became easier, but because you stopped making it harder through resistance. You become wiser, not because you learned more concepts, but because you learned when to release. You become freer, not because everything went your way, but because you no longer needed it to. This quiet rebuilding is slow, subtle, and deeply transformative. It does not announce itself, but over time, you realize that you are no longer the same person who clung so tightly to fear, control, and expectation. You have not lost yourself. You have shed what was weighing you down, and in that release, life has gently shaped you into someone more grounded, more aware, and more at peace with the unfolding of each moment. 9. When you let go quietly, you stop fighting yourself, and life begins to flow. One of the most overlooked truths in Buddhism is that much of our suffering does not come from the world, other people, or circumstances, but from the inner war we constantly fight with ourselves. We argue with our emotions, resist our thoughts, judge our past, and pressure our future, believing that this internal struggle is necessary for improvement or survival. Over time, this quiet self-conflict becomes so normal that we stop noticing how deeply exhausting it is. Letting go quietly is the moment this inner war begins to end, not through force or denial, but through understanding. From a Buddhist perspective, the mind suffers most when it refuses to accept its own experience. You feel sadness and immediately tell yourself you should not feel this way. You feel fear and criticize yourself for being weak. You feel uncertainty and demand instant clarity. This constant self-correction creates tension because you are fighting what is already present. Letting go quietly means allowing your inner experience to exist without immediately trying to fix, suppress, or judge it. This allowance does not make emotions stronger. It allows them to complete their natural cycle and pass. When you stop fighting yourself, the mind begins to soften. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer collide with resistance. Emotions still move through you, but they are no longer treated as enemies. Buddhism teaches that awareness transforms experience not by controlling it, but by understanding it. When you observe your inner world with patience instead of hostility, the mind naturally finds balance. This balance is not forced calm, but a steady acceptance that removes unnecessary struggle. Letting go quietly also means releasing the belief that you must constantly improve or prove yourself in order to be worthy of peace. Many people live with an internal voice that demands progress, success, or perfection before rest is allowed. Buddhism challenges this belief by teaching that worth is not earned through struggle, but realized through awareness. When you let go of constant self-pressure, you begin to experience peace not as a reward, but as a natural state that was always available beneath effort and fear. As inner conflict dissolves, life begins to flow more smoothly, not because problems disappear, but because you are no longer adding resistance to them. Challenges arise, but you meet them with openness instead of tension. Decisions become clearer because they are not clouded by anxiety or self-doubt. Relationships feel less draining because you are no longer projecting unresolved inner conflict onto others. Buddhism teaches that when the mind is not divided against itself, action becomes simple and effective. This inner alignment also changes how you experience effort. When you are fighting yourself, even small tasks feel heavy because they are loaded with expectation and self-judgment. When you let go quietly, effort becomes lighter because it is no longer driven by fear or desperation. You act because action is needed, not because you are trying to escape discomfort or prove value. This shift allows you to move through life with greater ease, even when circumstances are demanding. Letting go quietly reveals how much energy was previously wasted on inner resistance. You begin to notice how much mental space was consumed by replaying the past, worrying about the future, or criticizing yourself in the present. As this resistance fades, that energy becomes available for awareness, creativity, and genuine engagement with life. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not about acquiring something new, but about releasing what drains you unnecessarily. When resistance falls away, vitality returns naturally. This release also deepens compassion, both for yourself and others. When you stop fighting your own imperfections, you become less reactive to the imperfections of others. You begin to understand that everyone is struggling with their own inner conflicts, fears, and attachments. This understanding softens judgment and replaces it with patience. Buddhism places great importance on compassion because it arises naturally when the mind is no longer hardened by self-conflict. As life begins to flow, you notice a subtle sense of trust, replacing anxiety. You trust your ability to respond rather than your ability to control. You trust the unfolding of events rather than clinging to rigid expectations. This trust is not naive optimism, it is grounded confidence built from experience. You have seen that when you stop fighting yourself, clarity emerges on its own. When clarity emerges, action follows naturally. When action is aligned, outcomes take care of themselves. Letting go quietly also changes your relationship with time. You stop rushing to become someone else or reach some imagined finish line. You begin to live more fully in each moment because you are no longer trying to escape the present. Buddhism teaches that suffering often comes from wanting the moment to be different than it is. When that wanting dissolves, The present becomes spacious and workable, even when it contains difficulty. Over time, this quiet letting go creates a deep inner steadiness. You are less shaken by praise or blame, success or failure, gain or loss. This steadiness does not make you indifferent, it makes you resilient. You still care, but you are no longer controlled by external fluctuations. Buddhism teaches that true freedom is the ability to remain balanced in the midst of change, and this balance is born from releasing inner resistance. When you let go quietly, life no longer feels like something you must conquer or survive. It begins to feel like something you can participate in fully, without fear or self-betrayal. You move with life instead of against it. You listen instead of constantly pushing. You respond instead of reacting. In this way, flow replaces force and understanding replaces struggle. Ultimately, letting go quietly is the end of the inner battle that drains peace and clarity. It is the moment you stop treating yourself as a problem to be fixed and start relating to yourself as a process to be understood. Buddhism teaches that this shift is the doorway to genuine freedom, because when you stop fighting yourself, nothing outside needs to be fought either. Life flows not because it became easier, but because resistance finally fell away, and in that openness, peace, clarity, and quiet strength naturally arise. 10. Letting go quietly teaches you to trust life without needing proof. One of the deepest struggles the human mind faces is the demand for proof before peace. We want guarantees before we relax, certainty before we trust, and visible signs before we surrender control. Buddhism teaches that this demand for proof is rooted in fear, not wisdom. The mind believes that if it can predict outcomes, control circumstances, or secure reassurance, then safety will follow. Yet life rarely provides certainty in advance, and waiting for proof before trusting keeps the mind permanently tense. Letting go quietly is the practice of trusting life without needing it to explain itself first. When you require proof before trusting, you postpone peace indefinitely. You tell yourself that calm will come once things are resolved, once clarity arrives, once people behave differently, or once the future feels secure. This mindset keeps peace locked in the future, always just out of reach. Buddhism teaches that peace does not arrive as a result of perfect conditions, but as a result of right relationship with uncertainty. Letting go quietly means allowing uncertainty to exist without turning it into a threat. It is the willingness to remain open even when answers are incomplete. Trust, in the Buddhist sense, is not blind belief that everything will go your way. It is confidence in your ability to meet whatever arises with awareness. When you let go quietly, you stop demanding that life prove itself safe before you soften. Instead, you soften first, and in that softness, life becomes more navigable. You discover that resilience does not come from certainty, but from flexibility. Buddhism teaches that what bends survives, and what hardens breaks. Many people confuse trust with passivity, but letting go quietly does not mean you stop acting or making choices. It means you stop acting from fear and compulsion. Your actions become calmer, clearer, and more appropriate to the moment, because they are no longer driven by panic or desperation. When trust replaces fear, you respond to life instead of bracing against it. This response is often wiser because it arises from presence rather than anxiety. Letting go quietly also reveals how often the mind demands reassurance that cannot realistically be given. You may want certainty that a relationship will last, that a decision will succeed, or that the future will be kind. Buddhism teaches that these guarantees do not exist, and seeking them only creates suffering. When you release the need for reassurance, you free yourself from constant disappointment. You begin to appreciate moments as they are, without demanding permanence from them. As trust deepens, your relationship with doubt changes. Doubt no longer paralyzes you because you no longer see it as a failure or threat. You understand that doubt is part of being human, not a sign that something is wrong. Buddhism teaches that wisdom includes uncertainty because certainty often closes the mind, while uncertainty keeps it open and attentive. Letting go quietly allows you to coexist with doubt without letting it dominate your choices. This quiet trust also transforms how you experience setbacks. When you trust life, challenges are no longer interpreted as personal punishments or signs of failure. They become information rather than judgment. You learn from them without collapsing under their weight. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when we take events personally, believing they define our worth or future. Letting go quietly dissolves this personalization, allowing you to adapt without self-blame. Trusting life without proof also brings emotional rest. The nervous system relaxes when it no longer feels responsible for predicting every outcome. You stop rehearsing worst-case scenarios and begin to conserve energy. This rest is not laziness. It is recovery from chronic vigilance. Buddhism recognizes that much mental exhaustion comes from trying to stay one step ahead of life. When you let go of this habit, the mind finds a natural rhythm that supports clarity rather than strain. As this trust matures, gratitude arises more naturally. You become less focused on what is missing and more aware of what is present. This shift does not require positive thinking. It emerges from acceptance. Buddhism teaches that gratitude is not forced appreciation, but clear seeing. When you stop arguing with life, you see more clearly what is already here. This clarity brings a quiet satisfaction that does not depend on circumstances being perfect. Letting go quietly also strengthens inner confidence. You begin to trust your ability to adjust, learn, and recover, rather than trusting outcomes to be predictable. This confidence is deeply stabilizing because it does not collapse when plans change. Buddhism teaches that true security comes from inner adaptability, not external guarantees. When you trust your capacity to meet life, you no longer need life to behave in a certain way for you to feel okay. Over time, this trust reshapes your identity. You no longer see yourself as someone waiting for life to become safe. You experience yourself as someone capable of living fully within uncertainty. This shift reduces fear at a fundamental level because you stop seeing the unknown as an enemy. Buddhism teaches that fear thrives on resistance, and when resistance dissolves, fear loses its grip. Letting go quietly teaches you that life does not need to be understood in advance to be lived wisely. You learn through experience rather than prediction. You respond rather than anticipate. This approach brings humility, patience, and presence into your life. Buddhism values these qualities because they allow growth without violence toward yourself or others. In the end, trusting life without proof is an act of deep courage. It is the courage to remain open without guarantees, to remain gentle without certainty, and to remain present without knowing how everything will unfold. Letting go quietly does not remove risk from life, but it removes unnecessary fear. You discover that peace was never waiting for proof, it was waiting for trust. When you finally release the need for certainty, life does not become smaller or more dangerous. It becomes more honest, more spacious, and more alive. You stop asking life to prove itself and start allowing it to reveal itself moment by moment. In that allowing, trust deepens, resistance fades, and peace becomes something you live with, not something you wait for. 11. Letting go quietly reveals that peace was never missing, only covered. Buddhism teaches that many people spend their entire lives searching for peace as if it was something distant, rare, or reserved for a future version of themselves. Yet the deeper truth is that peace is not absent from our lives. It is simply buried beneath layers of resistance, fear, attachment, and constant mental activity. We believe peace must be earned through success, understanding, or perfect conditions. But this belief itself becomes the greatest obstacle. Letting go quietly is the act of removing what covers peace, not the act of creating peace from nothing. From an early age, the mind learns to stay busy. It learns to plan, worry, compare, analyze, and defend. Over time, this constant mental motion becomes normal, and stillness begins to feel uncomfortable or even unsafe. We mistake this discomfort for danger, and so we keep the mind occupied, believing that thinking more will protect us. Buddhism teaches that this habit is deeply rooted in fear, because a noisy mind avoids the vulnerability of presence. Letting go quietly means allowing the mind to slow down without trying to replace noise with distraction. When the mind finally pauses, even briefly, something surprising becomes apparent. There is a natural sense of calm underneath the thoughts, a quiet steadiness that does not depend on circumstances. This calm was always there, but it was overshadowed by constant engagement with worry, memory, and expectation. Buddhism teaches that awareness itself is peaceful by nature, and that suffering arises when awareness becomes entangled with thoughts instead of observing them. Letting go quietly disentangles awareness from mental noise, revealing peace that was never lost. Many people resist this revelation because it challenges the belief that peace must be achieved through effort. If peace is already present, then the endless striving, fixing, and improving lose their urgency. This can feel unsettling to the ego, which depends on struggle for its sense of purpose. Buddhism gently points out that effort is useful for ethical living and mindful action, but unnecessary for accessing peace. Letting go quietly is the willingness to rest in what is already here without demanding progress or proof. As you let go, you begin to notice how often you leave the present moment mentally. You may be sitting quietly, but your mind is elsewhere, replaying the past or anticipating the future. Buddhism teaches that peace exists only in the present, because the past is memory and the future is imagination. When you gently release the habit of mental wandering, even for a moment, peace becomes tangible. It does not announce itself dramatically. It feels simple, ordinary, and deeply familiar. This discovery changes your relationship with problems. Difficulties still arise, but they no longer define the entire landscape of experience. You realize that pain can exist within peace, just as waves exist within the ocean without disturbing its depth. Buddhism uses this metaphor to explain that surface disturbances do not negate inner stillness. Letting go quietly allows you to experience challenges without losing contact with the calm that exists beneath them. This does not make you indifferent, it makes you grounded. As peace becomes more accessible, you also begin to see how often you were unknowingly covering it up. You notice how judgment tightens the mind, how comparison stirs restlessness, and how attachment creates anxiety. These mental habits are not evil or wrong, they are learned patterns. Buddhism teaches compassion toward these patterns rather than condemnation. Letting go quietly means recognizing these habits and gently releasing them when they arise, without turning the release into another form of struggle. This gentle release deepens self-acceptance. When you stop believing that something is fundamentally wrong with you, the inner critic begins to soften. You no longer see yourself as a project that must be fixed before peace is allowed. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not becoming someone else, but seeing clearly what you already are. Letting go quietly allows this clarity to emerge naturally, without force or self-judgment. As peace becomes more visible, Your relationship with desire also changes. You still have goals, preferences, and intentions, but they no longer feel urgent or desperate. You pursue them without tying your worth or happiness to their outcome. Buddhism teaches that desire becomes suffering only when it demands fulfillment for peace to exist. Letting go quietly removes this demand, allowing desire to exist without domination. This creates a sense of freedom, even while engaging fully with life. You also begin to notice how peace influences your interactions with others. When you are not internally restless, you listen more deeply and react less defensively. Conversations feel lighter because you are no longer trying to protect an image or win approval. Buddhism emphasizes right speech and right listening as natural expressions of inner calm. Letting go quietly allows relationships to be guided by presence rather than projection. Over time, peace stops feeling fragile. You realize that it does not disappear when life becomes difficult, but only when you abandon awareness and return to resistance. This realization builds trust in yourself, because you know that peace is accessible whenever you are willing to release unnecessary struggle. Buddhism teaches that this trust is a form of wisdom because it is based on direct experience rather than belief. Letting go quietly also brings humility. You recognize that you do not need to understand everything to be at peace. You stop demanding explanations from life and begin to accept mystery as part of existence. Buddhism teaches that not knowing is not a flaw, but a doorway to openness. When you release the need to know, the mind relaxes and peace deepens. As this understanding matures, you begin to live differently. You make choices with less urgency and more clarity. You rest without guilt and act without compulsion. You allow yourself to be human without constantly correcting yourself. This way of living is not dramatic or outwardly impressive, but it is deeply stable. Buddhism teaches that true peace is quiet, consistent, and sustainable. In the end, letting go quietly reveals that peace was never something to be achieved, earned, or deserved. It was always present, patiently waiting beneath layers of fear, effort, and resistance. When you stop adding to those layers, peace naturally shines through. You do not become someone new. You remember what was always true. And in that remembering, life feels lighter, clearer, and more deeply lived, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer at war with what is. 12. Letting go quietly is the final act of inner maturity. Buddhism teaches that inner maturity is not measured by age, knowledge, or spiritual language, but by the ability to release what no longer serves without resentment, drama, or resistance. Many people believe maturity means enduring more, tolerating more, or becoming emotionally hardened, but true maturity is far subtler and far more powerful. It is the ability to recognize when holding on has become harmful and to step back without needing to justify, explain, or blame. Letting go quietly is not avoidance. It is discernment, and discernment is one of the highest forms of wisdom. In earlier stages of life, the mind clings because it is afraid. It clings to people because it fears abandonment, to beliefs because it fears uncertainty, and to identities because it fears emptiness. This clinging is not foolish, it is protective. Buddhism teaches compassion toward these stages because they are part of learning. However, there comes a moment when the mind realizes that what once felt protective is now limiting. Letting go quietly marks the transition from survival to understanding. It is the moment you stop confusing attachment with safety. Inner maturity reveals itself when you no longer need conflict to validate your decisions. You do not need to announce your departure, expose others, or prove that you were right. You simply step away, calmly and cleanly, because you understand that peace is more valuable than victory. Buddhism teaches that the need to be right often hides a deeper fear of being invalidated. When that fear dissolves, so does the need for confrontation. Letting go quietly is the natural outcome of this inner shift. As maturity deepens, you also begin to release emotional reactivity. You stop taking everything personally because you understand that people act from their own conditioning, pain, and limitations. This understanding does not excuse harmful behavior, but it prevents you from internalizing it. Buddhism teaches that wisdom includes the ability to see causes and conditions clearly. When you see clearly, anger softens, blame loosens, and compassion becomes possible. Letting go quietly reflects this clarity, because you no longer need to punish yourself or others to move forward. Another sign of inner maturity is the willingness to accept disappointment without collapse. Life will not always meet your expectations, and people will not always show up as you hoped. In less mature states, disappointment turns into bitterness or self-attack. In maturity, disappointment is acknowledged, felt, and released. Buddhism teaches that suffering intensifies when disappointment is resisted. Letting go quietly allows disappointment to pass without hardening into resentment. You feel fully, but you do not cling. Inner maturity also changes how you relate to effort. You stop forcing outcomes that require alignment rather than pressure. You recognize when persistence is wise and when persistence is simply attachment in disguise. Buddhism emphasizes right effort, which means knowing when to act and when to stop. Letting go quietly is often an act of right effort, because it conserves energy instead of wasting it on battles that cannot be won through force. As this maturity settles, your sense of identity becomes less rigid. You no longer define yourself solely by roles, achievements, or opinions. You allow yourself to evolve without clinging to who you used to be. Buddhism teaches that clinging to identity creates suffering because identity is always changing. Letting go quietly allows growth without identity crisis. You adapt without losing your sense of self, because your self is no longer confined to a narrow definition. You also begin to value simplicity over intensity. Instead of dramatic highs and lows, you prefer steadiness and clarity. This does not mean life becomes dull, it means life becomes sustainable. Buddhism teaches the middle way, which avoids extremes. Letting go quietly is a direct expression of this path, because it avoids both suppression and indulgence. You neither cling nor reject. You allow and move forward. With maturity comes a deeper respect for silence. You understand that not everything needs to be shared, explained, or processed aloud. Silence becomes a space of integration rather than avoidance. Buddhism honors silence because it allows insight to settle. Letting go quietly honors this process, giving the mind time to adjust without interference. You trust the internal process instead of demanding immediate closure. Inner maturity also reshapes your relationship with loss. You begin to see loss not only as an ending, but as a completion. Something served its purpose, taught its lesson, and naturally concluded. Buddhism teaches impermanence not to diminish meaning, but to deepen appreciation. Letting go quietly allows you to honor what was without trying to preserve it beyond its time. This honoring brings closure without clinging. As you mature inwardly, your actions become less reactive and more intentional. You choose based on values rather than impulses. You respond instead of react. Buddhism teaches that this intentionality is a sign of awakening because it reflects awareness, guiding behavior. Letting go quietly supports this awareness because it removes emotional clutter that distorts perception. There is also a quiet confidence that emerges with maturity. You no longer need external validation to feel grounded. You trust your inner sense of direction even when others do not understand it. Buddhism teaches that inner confidence arises from alignment, not approval. Letting go quietly reflects this confidence because you no longer require agreement to proceed. Over time, this maturity brings a deep sense of dignity. You carry yourself with less defensiveness and more ease. You do not rush to prove your worth because you no longer question it constantly. Buddhism teaches that dignity arises when the mind is not fragmented by fear and desire. Letting go quietly allows this dignity to surface naturally. In the final stages of this process, you realize that letting go is not something you do once, but something you practice repeatedly with gentleness and patience. Each release refines awareness. Each quiet ending creates space for clarity. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not a single moment, but a gradual unfolding. Letting go quietly is one of the most reliable signs that this unfolding is happening. Ultimately, letting go quietly is the final act of inner maturity because it reflects understanding rather than reaction, trust rather than fear, and wisdom rather than force. It shows that you no longer need struggle to feel alive or conflict to feel justified. You move forward without dragging the past behind you. You allow life to change you without resisting it. And in this quiet, steady movement, you embody one of the deepest truths Buddhism offers, that freedom does not announce itself loudly, but reveals itself in how gently you are able to release. Letting go quietly is not a single decision you make once and forget. It is a way of relating to life that deepens with awareness, patience, and honesty. Buddhism teaches that suffering fades not because life becomes perfect, but because the mind stops demanding perfection from what is naturally impermanent. When you let go quietly, you stop forcing answers, stop chasing reassurance, and stop fighting experiences that were never meant to be controlled. In that release, life does not collapse, it opens, revealing a rhythm that is calmer, clearer, and more trustworthy than struggle ever was. Through letting go, you learn that peace was never something missing from your life, but something constantly covered by fear, attachment, resistance, and endless mental noise. As each layer falls away, you discover a steadiness that does not depend on outcomes, people, or certainty. You begin to live with less tension and more presence, responding to life instead of bracing against it. Challenges still arise, but they no longer define you or drain you in the same way, because you meet them with understanding rather than resistance. Letting go quietly also teaches you humility and compassion toward yourself and toward others. You realize that everyone is moving through their own struggles, attachments, and awakenings. This realization softens judgment and replaces it with patience. You no longer need to prove your worth, defend your path, or explain your silence. Life itself becomes the expression of your clarity. Your actions speak without effort, and your calm becomes a quiet form of strength. As you continue walking this path, you discover that letting go is not about withdrawing from life, but about participating in it more fully and honestly. You feel more grounded in the present moment, more trusting of your inner guidance, and more open to change. You stop trying to hold life still and begin moving with it, allowing growth to happen without force. This is not passivity, it is alignment. And alignment brings a peace that effort cannot manufacture. In the end, letting go quietly is an act of deep wisdom. It is the recognition that freedom does not come from controlling life, but from understanding it. When you release what no longer serves, life speaks more clearly. When the mind becomes quiet, truth becomes audible. And when you stop fighting yourself and the world, life unfolds with a gentleness that feels both liberating and profoundly familiar. This is the quiet promise Buddhism offers, that when you let go without resistance, life opens and peace walks beside you naturally, moment by moment.